Objective: to understand how web works, what is cruise missile architecture, how client-based attacks are performed, how server-based attacks are performed, how application-based attacks are performed. Outcome: on completion of this chapter, the participants will understand how web works and what cruise missile architecture is, how client, server and application-based attack vectors are performed. www. World Wide Web. Commonly known as the web, is a collection of electronic hypertext documents stored in a computer, linked together like a spider's web, which can be accessed via internet. Let's take a live example to get an idea of how the web works. The web browser is a software program to access information from the web. For example, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, Chrome, etc. In a day, 3.3 billion searches happen on Google. Let's see exactly what happens when you type www.google.com and click Enter on your web browser. The browser parses this URL into three parts: protocol name, server name, and the path to the page in the server. Blank space usually denotes the index as the path. By default, when a page request is made, it fetches the index.html page, whereas a specific path, say about.html, is mentioned, it fetches about.html from the corresponding server. When this parsed URL comes out of the browser, it becomes an HTTP request, consisting of the following parts. Let us discuss these parts briefly. Request line consists of three components such as method, the path to the page on the server, and HTTP version. The method is used to forward the request to the server. The predominant methods used are GET and POST. A normal GET request looks like this, wherein the parameters such as username and password are passed on the URL. A typical POST request appears to be like this, in which all parameters are passed in the message body itself. By default, the first request method will be GET. However, the consecutive request method depends on the application, which may either be GET or POST. General headers consists of the timestamp of the request, the connection type between the client and the server that may be persistent or closed. Request headers consists of the domain name of the server, acceptable type of the page, either text, image, or application on HTML, the type of browser that initiated the request. Entity headers are optional and are followed by a carriage return or line feed to represent the demarcation between the headers and the message body. Message body contains the actual content. This HTTP request is then passed on to the router, from where it is routed to a proxy server. If set, the proxy server acts as a mediator between the client and the server to serve the following purposes: audit, for maintenance of network logs; internet usage, to report effective utilization of bandwidth; and caching, for speedy retrieval of the web pages. Generally, the request is forwarded to the firewall, but in some cases the proxy is placed after the firewall, that is, outside the network, in order to conceal the identity of the network. Now the request is passed onto the firewall that is conventionally designed to control ports and is allowed to gain access between the clients and the server. One may often get confused with terminologies such as proxy, firewall, and proxy firewall. Let's see the difference between a proxy and a firewall. When a proxy receives a request, it checks the access list for the application layer protocols. Based on this, the proxy forwards or blocks the request. When a firewall receives a request, it checks the access list for the ports. However, an application-level firewall also checks for programs in the access list. The request gets forwarded or dropped based on this list. When the request goes out of your network, The HTTP request header has the information of the domain name of the server, which it has to reach, but remains unaware of its IP location. For the very reason the request goes to the domain name server, the DNS translates the domain name to its corresponding IP address. Once it gets the server IP, the request is forwarded to the corresponding server. So, what is a server? As the name implies, it is a computer that serves the requests from the clients. What is a web server? When the server service, such as Apache, Tomcat, IIS, or Zeus, is installed on a computer, it becomes a web server capable of handling requests for the static pages. Installing services such as Oracle WebLogic or Glassfish over a web server will transform it into a web application server. This is capable of handling requests to process them based on the business logic and to respond accordingly. The business logic may be implemented using a web application or a web service. What is a web application? It is a program written using packages such as Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, etc. to accomplish a task. Example, Google Maps. What is a web service? When a web application uses open standards such as XML, SOAP, and HTTP to provide interoperability between applications running on different platforms, they are termed as web services. Consider an example, www.virustotal.com. This website fetches services from various antivirus web applications such as Bitdefender, Avira, Avast, etc. in order to give a consolidated report. What is a database server? Software such as MySQL, MSSQL, PostgreSQL, etc. provides database services to other programs like web applications and web services called a database server. In this case, our request www.google.com is for a static web page from google.com. The request for this static web page is handled by a web server. Suppose if the request is for a location on Google Maps, it will be processed by the web application server to fetch the corresponding result from the database, which is managed by the database server. When the request is for fetching a file from a server, it is handled by a file server. What is a file server? A computer installed with software such as FileZilla, Logical Dock, Cerberus FTP, etc., which is purposely designed for storing, sharing, and publishing files, is called a file server. This again uses the DB server to access the requested file from the DB and returns it back to the web server to produce the HTTP response. When the request is for sending or receiving a mail, it is handled by a mail server. What is a mail server? A computer installed with software such as Mercury Mail Transport System, HMail Server, etc. for handling mail requests and responses is called a mail server. When the request is to send emails, the mail server uses SMTP on port 25, and when the request is to receive, it uses POP3 on port 110. When the requests are processed by the corresponding servers, it generates corresponding responses where the actual HTTP response looks like this and consists of the following parts. Status line. The request line of the HTTP request is replaced by this status line in the response. It consists of the HTTP version. Status code is used for defining the state of the web application or the web page that has been requested for. This is clustered into 5 different groups. If the status code falls between 100 to 199, it is meant for experimental purpose. 200 to 299 shows successful page access. 300 to 399 denotes redirection of the request. 400 to 499 denotes client errors, and 500 to 599 denotes server errors. Reason phrase. A brief description of the status code. For example, status code 404 denotes client error and the corresponding reason phrase is page not found. General headers consists of the timestamp of the response and the connection type between the client and the server that may be persistent or closed. Response headers consists of the name and version of the server that hosts the domain. Accept ranges may be bytes or none, When it is none, the client needs to wait until all the elements of the web page are rendered. When it is bytes, the server allows partial loading of the elements of the web page. Entity headers consists of the content type that gives information about the type of content in the body of the message. Content length denotes the length of the message. Last modified denotes the timestamp of the last update of the message. Message body, the actual response for the request. The response is then processed by the web browser to display the requested content. Next time when a user requests google.com, instead of fetching the response from the server, the browser processes the request using previously stored responses from web cache. A request that passes through a router, proxy, firewall, web server, web application server, and database server to fetch a response looks like a cruise missile, thus making us christen this structure of working as the cruise missile architecture. Client-based attacks. Phishing. An attempt to steal sensitive data via electronic communications by being disguised as a trustworthy internet resource is called as phishing. Phishing can be done by either of the following methods: redirection using localhost, redirection using server, base64 encoding, host file manipulation, and full screen API. The first method is redirection using localhost. Before stepping further, one must know what localhost is. Localhost refers to the default name of the computer, that is 127.0.0.1, which is also called the local host or loopback address. Each system has a distinct system name, say System 1, and a unique IP address, say for instance 192.168.1.9. To make a system act as a server, one needs to install XAMPP. XAMPP is a cross-platform server stack consisting of a mail server, file server, web server, and a database server. Once installed, the XAMPP control panel can be opened. This now allows starting the Apache server, which will make your system act as a web server. As seen earlier, a web server is the one responsible for handling requests and responses. Let us see what happens when we type www.gmail.com into the browser. The request is handled by the DNS server, which translates the hostname to the IP address and redirects the request to the corresponding server. The server holds many files from which the default index.html file is fetched as the response. Similarly, when we type in localhost in the browser, the request is handled by a server running on the same system called the local host. This displays the XAMPP page as a response fetching its contents from the htdocs folder in the XAMPP server. When the content of this page is replaced with that of the Gmail phishing page, the response thrown for the request of the local host would be the Gmail phishing page. So, how do you create this phishing page content? This can be done in just 2 steps. Crafting the fake page. Go to the browser and type in gmail.com. Save the page in the htdocs folder after deleting the existing content with the name index.html. Making it work. Open Notepad, paste this piece of code, save it as mail.php in the htdocs folder. Thus your phishing page content is ready. When you type localhost in the browser, it will now fetch a Gmail phishing page. When a username and password is typed in, a request gets generated that points to the Gmail server for authentication. Uh-oh, what is happening? Rewinding back, when the Gmail phishing page, that is index.html file, was saved as such, the action attribute of the form holds the link that points to the Gmail server for authentication. So what can be done to redirect this request? Replacing this link with that of mail.php and saving it will redirect the request to the local host server for authentication, which will be handled by mail.php. What happens when the request reaches mail.php? This piece of code redirects the victim to the original Gmail page while the request parameters, such as username and password, are captured. This piece of code creates a new file named log.txt in the htdocs folder. and logs the user input such as username and password. Thus, you have completed a phishing attack. Now, when other systems within the network access the local host, it opens the Gmail phishing page. When a user keys in the login credentials, it gets logged and appended onto the log.txt file. Similarly, when the other systems, say System 2 and System 3, keys in their login credentials, the data gets logged and appended to the log.txt file. Redirection using server. This system, which is acting as a server in the LAN, can be connected to the internet directly without address translation. Now, share your IP address with the victim. When the victim accesses your IP, it leads them to the phishing page hosted on your system. Phishing, the act of acquiring sensitive data through any electronic communications by pretending as a credible source, is called phishing. Phishing can be done by any of the following methods: redirection using localhost, redirection using server, base64 encoding, host file manipulation, and full screen API. Redirection using localhost. In this method, the phishing page is hosted on the local host to phish a user. Note: open htdocs folder on the XAMPP server and cut all its contents and paste it in a new folder on the desktop named as XAMPP Backup. Task: creating a phishing page for Facebook. Number 1. Open browser and type in facebook.com. Number 2. Save the page as index.html in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server. Number 3. Put this piece of code in a notepad and save it as mail.php in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server. Number 4. Now open the index.html file with Notepad and search for the action attribute and change the URL to mail.php and save the file. Number 5. By opening command prompt and typing in ifconfig, get your internal IP and try accessing this IP from another system in your internal network. If another system is not accessible, open your browser and type in localhost. Number 6. This now opens the Facebook phishing page. Type in the username and password and click on Login. Result: open log.txt file to view the username and password of the Facebook user. Redirection using server. In this method, the system in which the phishing page is hosted is connected to the internet directly. Note: when connecting to the internet directly, see to it that address translation is disabled in the router. The best way to make your system the hosting site would be to connect via dongle. Task: creating a phishing page for Facebook. Number 1. Open the browser and type in facebook.com. Number 2. Save the page as index.html in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server after deleting the existing contents in that folder. Number 3. Put this piece of code in a notepad and save it as mail.php in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server. Number 4. Now open the index.html file with Notepad and search for the action attribute and change the URL over there to mail.php. Save this file. Number 5. Note your IP by visiting whatismyip.com and send this IP as a link to the victim. Number 6. Type in the username, password and click on Login. Result: open the log.txt file to view the username and password of the Facebook user. SQL Injection Basics. Have you ever wondered what exactly happens when you type your username and password on a web page and click Login? The user input username and password is sent as an HTTP request to the web server, which hands over this request to the web application server that generates an SQL query to check the equity of the user by fetching the data from the database. But the question is, what is SQL and database? SQL, Structured Query Language, is the query that functions to fetch and access the data from the database. A database is a collection of data, arranged intelligently in terms of tables, with rows and columns similar to an Excel sheet. Rows are also called tuples or records, and columns are called fields or attributes. The combination of rows and columns is known as tables. The database server holds an information database called information_schema to store details such as the databases, tables, columns, views, and procedures on the server. For example, if there are two user databases, namely infisec and test, the information schema consists of read-only tables pertaining to infisec and test to hold the details of their structure, that is, the tables and their columns in the database. Information_schema.tables holds the details of all the tables in a database. Information_schema.columns holds the details pertaining to all the columns of tables in a database. The details of specific tables and databases can be accessed using table_name and tables_schema, respectively. Generally, these values in the tables are stored as hexadecimal values. Let us take a look at the query that gets formed when the web application receives a request. Based on the user input, the query gets modified as follows. Upon receiving the request, the database server checks for the combination of the username and password in the table users that resides inside the database infisec. When the data is incorrect, it throws login failed as a response. When the data is correct, the requested data, that is, the account details of the user, is fetched as the response. This page in the web application allows the user to perform operations on the table. By clicking on the search button, the user details can be viewed. When an input, say 31413, and Chennai is given, it generates a request that gets forwarded to a web application server to generate the following query. This now fetches the list of usernames from the table users, whose contact number is 31413 and city is Chennai. In a select statement, the relevant data is fetched using either AND or OR logical operators. AND operator fetches a record only when both the conditions in an SQL query are true. For example, when an AND operator is used in this select statement, it fetches records of users who have both given contact number and the city as that of the user input. On the other hand, OR operator fetches a record if either the first condition or the second condition is true. In the same example, when an OR operator is used in this select statement, it fetches records of users who have either given the contact number or the city as that of the user input. This is how a select statement works. The result is now forwarded to the web app server, which sends it to the web server that delivers it to the client. The next button on the web application allows the user to delete a given record. Take, for example, when the user clicks on Delete and clicks on Confirm, it forms the query as shown. This deletes the entire record of the user whose ID in the database is 1. The next is the drop query. This action is allowed only for users with high privileges, and the query formed is of this form, which deletes the entire structure of the table users, along with the records in the table. Drop query and delete query does the same job of deletion. The only difference between them is that drop query deletes the entire table, while delete query deletes only the records in a table. This is how a delete and drop query work. The result of this query is now forwarded to the web app server, which sends it to the web server that delivers it to the client. View Account Details button allows the user to view all their account details. When a user clicks on this button, a query of this form is generated. The entire account details of a user can include details such as first name, last name, contact details, account, category, etc., which are maintained on different tables. Here, the details such as contact and city are located under table users, and details such as account and account category are located under the table user_info. In such a scenario, the union command allows obtaining a result set from different tables by combining two select statements with a condition that the number of columns selected in both the statements is the same. This is how a union command works. This command now retrieves the contact and city from the table users pertaining to user ID 1, along with the account and category from the table user_info, whose ID is also 1. The result is now forwarded to the web app server, which sends it to the web server that delivers the result to the client. This is how the web application processes the human understandable user input to generate machine understandable SQL query for responding to user requests. SQL injection. Instead of a human understandable input when an SQL query is injected to exploit the web application, either to breach the authentication system or to fetch unauthorized information from the database, it is called SQL injection.